He's going to disinherit you if you keep this up. The words, dripping with faux concern, were barely a whisper, yet they hung in the air between us like a physical weight. My sister, Clara, leaned back in her pristine armchair, a smirk playing on her lips, her gaze fixed on some distant point in her immaculately decorated living room. I didn't need to look to know she wasn't talking about her own inheritance. She was talking about mine. The implication was clear: my struggles, my perceived failures, were a stain on the family name, a potential drain on the considerable fortune our grandfather had amassed. It wasn't the first time she'd thrown something like this at me, a veiled threat cloaked in sisterly advice, but this time it felt different. It felt final. My normal, if one could call it that, was a quiet existence. I lived in a small, slightly ramshackle house I'd inherited from my grandmother, a comfortable space, filled with the scent of old books and brewing tea. My grandfather, Arthur, a man of immense wealth and an even more immense ego, had always been a looming presence. He was the architect of our family's fortune, a self-made titan who believed in strength, resilience, and, above all, control. He'd always favored Clara, the eldest, the one who mirrored his ambition and his ruthlessness. I, the younger, the dreamer, the artist, had always been the disappointment, the one who needed a gentle hand, a guiding principle. Arthur saw this as weakness. Clara saw it as an opportunity. She was, in a word, spectacular. Clara possessed a certain brilliance, a sharp, calculating mind that had navigated the corporate world with ruthless efficiency. She was married to a successful lawyer, lived in a mansion, and her children attended the most exclusive boarding schools. She was the golden child, the one who always made him proud. I, on the other hand, was still trying to find my footing. My art, while gaining some recognition, didn't exactly pay the bills consistently. I'd asked Arthur for a small business loan once, to help me open a small gallery. He'd lectured me for an hour about financial responsibility, then pointedly suggested I find a more stable career. Clara, meanwhile, had secured her father's investment in her husband's firm with a simple phone call. The disparity was a constant, dull ache. One memory, sharp and clear, always surfaced when I thought of Clara's entitlement. It was the year our grandmother passed. We were gathered for the reading of the will, a somber affair in the grand oak-paneled study of our childhood home. Arthur sat at the head of the table, his face etched with grief, but his eyes, even then, held a calculating gleam. As the lawyer droned on, detailing bequests, Clara's hand kept straying to her designer handbag. When it came to the part about grandmother's antique jewelry collection, pieces passed down through generations, each with its own story, Clara's breath hitched. As soon as the lawyer finished, before the mournful silence could even settle, she was across the room, sifting through a velvet box, her fingers tracing the exquisite craftsmanship of a diamond necklace. "Oh, this will look divine with my gala dress," she'd announced, oblivious to the stunned silence. Arthur had simply cleared his throat, a silent acknowledgement of her swift action. I, meanwhile, had watched, a lump forming in my throat, remembering my grandmother wearing that very necklace at my art school graduation, a proud smile on her face. Another time, years later, I'd mentioned a potential opportunity to Arthur, a grant I was eligible for, one that could fund a year of artistic research abroad. He'd dismissed it outright. Frivolous, he'd declared, his voice echoing in his cavernous office. "You need to focus on building something tangible, something with a return. Not these artistic flights of fancy." I'd left his office that day feeling hollowed out. A week later, I overheard Clara discussing her new sports car with Arthur. He'd not only approved of the purchase but had offered to help finance it, calling it a necessary asset for her public image. The hypocrisy was so blatant, so ingrained in their dynamic, that it barely registered as surprise anymore. It was just life. My life. Clara's pronouncement about disinheritance had been made last week, during a strained family dinner at Arthur's sprawling estate. The air had been thick with unspoken tensions, the usual polite facade cracking under the weight of simmering resentments. Arthur, frail but still imposing, had been recounting his early days of building his empire, a familiar story of grit and determination. Clara, perched on the edge of her seat, had interjected with a comment about how some people just don't have that drive, do they, father? Her eyes had flicked towards me. My stomach had tightened. Later, after Arthur had retired for the evening, leaving Clara and me to deal with the polite but tedious aftermath of her husband's boasts about a recent legal victory, she'd cornered me. We were in the dimly lit solarium, the scent of jasmine heavy in the air. She'd been sipping her wine, her expression a mask of feigned concern. That's when she'd delivered the line, "He's going to disinherit you if you keep this up." The words had been a cold, sharp slap. The betrayal, however, wasn't just her words. It was what happened next. The following morning, I received a summons. Not a friendly text, not a casual invitation. A formal letter, delivered by courier, requesting my presence at Arthur's lawyer's office at noon. My heart sank. I arrived to find Arthur already there, seated in a sterile, modern conference room. Clara was beside him, looking unnervingly composed, her expression one of triumphant satisfaction. The lawyer, a man I'd never met before, introduced himself with practiced neutrality. He cleared his throat, then began to read. It wasn't a will. It was a legal document, a power of attorney, a financial disclosure statement. Arthur, it turned out, had been having discussions with his financial advisors about restructuring his assets. And Clara, the responsible daughter, the one who understood business, had been appointed as his sole trustee and beneficiary, effective immediately. Arthur, his voice weak but resolute, confirmed it. Arthur needs to ensure his legacy is protected, he'd said, his gaze fixed on me, not with anger, but with a profound, weary disappointment. And Clara is the only one capable of that. Clara, meanwhile, hadn't said a word. She just offered a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. The smugness, the absolute certainty of her victory, radiated from her. She'd orchestrated this. She'd used my perceived weaknesses, my grandfather's biases, and turned them into a weapon. The room felt cold, the silence deafening, punctuated only by the rustle of paper and the chilling finality of Arthur's pronouncement. I felt a strange detachment, as if I were watching a scene unfold from a distance. The betrayal was absolute. The days that followed were a blur of quiet resolve. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. Clara and her husband had made sure of that. They'd isolated me, painting me as unstable, unreliable, a risk to Arthur's dwindling fortune. Arthur, in his declining health, had become a prisoner of their narrative. But they had underestimated me. They had underestimated the quiet tenacity that Arthur saw as weakness, the resilience I'd cultivated in the face of their constant judgment. I didn't have armies of lawyers or vast sums of money to fight them head-on. But I had something they'd overlooked, knowledge. I spent hours poring over old family documents, letters, and, crucially, the trust agreement Arthur had set up years ago when he'd first started transferring significant assets to his children. It was a complex document, filled with legalese and contingency clauses. I remembered a specific provision, one Arthur had always dismissed as irrelevant, something about artistic patronage and the preservation of cultural heritage. It was a clause he'd insisted on, a nod, perhaps, to his late wife's passion for the arts. A clause Clara, in her haste and her arrogance, had likely glossed over. I found it on a Tuesday morning. Arthur was in his assisted living facility, Clara likely ensconced in her luxurious home, basking in her newfound control. I drove to the lawyer's office, the same one that had read me my own eviction notice, effectively. This time, I didn't have an appointment. I walked in, my heart steady, my hands empty. I asked to speak with the senior partner, the one who had drafted the trust agreement years ago. He was initially dismissive, but when I presented him with the specific clause, his brow furrowed. He excused himself, returning with a thick file. The clause stipulated that a significant portion of the trust was designated for the establishment and endowment of a foundation dedicated to supporting emerging artists, with specific criteria for its governance and operation. It also included a stipulation that if the appointed trustee failed to adhere to the spirit and letter of this provision for a period of 6 months, a designated alternate trustee would assume control. And that alternate trustee, appointed by Arthur himself in case of his incapacitation or Clara's unsuitability, was me. The lawyer explained the implications. Clara, in her eagerness to liquidate assets for her own benefit, had already begun selling off some of the art and antiques designated for the foundation. She had made no move to establish the foundation itself, nor had she indicated any intention of doing so. She was, by the letter of the law, in breach of contract. The lawyer, a man of his word, saw the undeniable truth of it. He looked at me, then at the document, a slow understanding dawning on his face. I didn't ask for anything immediately. I simply let the information sink in. I thanked him for his time and left. The drive home was silent, a stark contrast to the storm that raged within me. The fallout was swift and brutal, though it played out largely through hushed phone calls and frantic emails that I never saw. Clara's initial reaction, I later learned through the grapevine of distant cousins, was disbelief, followed by a torrent of rage. She tried to argue, to claim Arthur's wishes were paramount, that I was misinterpreting the clause. But the law, and the lawyer who had drafted the document, were on my side. The assets, the very ones she had believed were hers for the taking, were now irrevocably tied to the establishment of the foundation. She couldn't touch them without risking further legal action. Her flying monkeys descended almost immediately. Aunts and uncles, loyal to Clara's perceived strength and Arthur's wishes, called me, their voices tinged with concern. "Are you sure about this, dear? Arthur wouldn't have wanted this division." They spoke of family harmony, of the importance of respecting elders. I listened patiently, my voice calm and measured. "The trust agreement is clear," I'd repeat, the words devoid of emotion. "This is what Arthur intended." Clara's husband, the lawyer, attempted to intervene, no doubt expecting to intimidate me with legal jargon. He made a few calls, sent a few sternly worded letters. But the terms were unambiguous. The foundation, with me at its helm, would now be established. Clara's carefully constructed plan to absorb Arthur's fortune had crumbled into dust. She was left with nothing but the legal obligation to fulfill a mandate she had no interest in, and the shame of her own greed laid bare for all to see. Arthur passed away a few months later, peacefully. Clara attended the funeral, her face a mask of practiced sorrow, but her eyes held a flicker of something else, a cold, hard resentment. She didn't speak to me. She couldn't. Her power over me, over Arthur's legacy, had been extinguished, not by a roar, but by a whisper of legal text. Now, I sit in my quiet studio, surrounded by canvases and the scent of turpentine. The foundation is up and running, providing opportunities for artists I believe in, artists Arthur would have never understood. Clara is still Clara, I assume, still living her life of outward success. But the foundation is a constant, silent testament to her undoing. There's no joy in it, not exactly. Just a quiet, profound sense of justice. The kind that doesn't need applause or validation. The kind that simply is.